Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Last week I showed you how to make these really cool mushroom pendants, and at the end of that video I said, I'm not done. Come back next week and I'm going to show you how I finish these off. And that's what we're doing today. We're going to start where we stopped. If you haven't seen the last video, I will link it above and below. Let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some silver plated 20 gauge wire, and I have a piece of steel wool, and I'm just going to run that steel wool over that wire a few times to shine it up. Now if your wire has some kinks in it, you can also take wire straightening pliers and you can put the wire through the jaw of those, and I'll show you how I do that as well. I don't really need to do it with the wire that I have, but just to show you how that works. All you do is you insert the wire in between the nylon jaws of the pliers and you just pull through, and it makes it nice and straight. So I'm not going to use a ruler or anything for this part. I'm just going to kind of eyeball the length of the wire, and I have my chain nose pliers and my round nose or rosary pliers at the ready, and I'm going to hold the wire up. And I'm going to plant the bottom of that wire like right about where the stem of my mushroom meets the ring on the bottom. So that's where I'm going to measure from. And I'm just going to maybe take 1 inch to 2 inches, and I'm going to snip that off. And I can always snip more off later. So it's better if it's a little longer rather than a little too short. So I cut 2 of those. One I made a little longer, the other a little shorter. And I'm going to get ready to solder. So I have some liquid flux. I'm going to pour just a tiny little bit, maybe less than a tablespoon, maybe a teaspoonful or so, into an old cup that I only use for flux. And I have a disposable brush. And the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to shape my wire, and I'm just going to create a simple little hook on the end like a shepherd's crook. Then I'm going to reposition my pliers and bring that little curl around into a full curl, and just one end of the wire is all you need to do. And then I'm going to pick up my other wire and do my second one. I'm also going to use my fingers to give it a little bit of a bend because, you know, nature, organic, you don't want it like stick straight. You want to have a little bit of motion, a little bit of movement in your wire. So I'm just going to kind of snip them down, and like I said, I hold them up against the mushroom and I just kind of figure out how long I want them to be. I don't want them to bump into the mushroom cap. I want them to be not too long and not too short, but just right. So the next thing I'm going to do is grab my flux brush, and I'm going to coat all the areas of those wire pieces with flux. I'm also going to put some flux at the bottom of my mushroom, and I did some decorative soldering there last week, and some of that will probably melt off when I stick these new pieces onto that, and that's fine. I'll just redo them later. So using an old pair of pliers that I only use for soldering, I will hold my pieces and I will just pick up a tiny little bit of solder, and I'm going to coat those pieces. That's called tinning. So we are going to give them a thin coating of lead-free solder. And if I didn't say it before, make sure you always wear safety glasses, work in a well-ventilated area, wear a respirator mask when soldering. It's also a really good idea to have a fume extractor or a high-quality air purifier. And I will link all the tools and materials that I use below. The next thing we're going to do is very carefully, I am going to hold the wire with my soldering pliers in my non-dominant hand and use my dominant hand with my hot soldering iron to apply just a little drop of solder to make that connection. I actually don't even really need much solder because there's already a lot at the bottom of that mushroom there. So I just kind of melt it all together. You have to try to have a steady hand. I know it's hard sometimes, especially when you're working with both hands. You can use like a third hand tool to help you hold things, but you get used to it after a while. I'm also going to use my pliers to move my wire a little bit, to give it a little bit of bend if it needs it. And then I'm just going to go back and add those drops of decorative solder at the bottom. Now, you can stop here. And you can say, okay, my project is done. I'm happy with it. I like the way it looks, or we can move on. And that's what I'm going to show you next. So for the next part of the project, we're going to add a little bit of sparkle. We want to, give it a little bit of flash and a little bit of color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out a couple beads. And the very first most important thing is that your beads fit on your wire. So we're going to check that in a minute, but this is how I organize my beads. This is just one of my many bead boxes. These are my Swarovski crystals, and I do organize them by size. So I have, like, this one box is all 4mm, and I write that on the edge so I can easily see it. I keep them all like in a big bookcase, and they're right at my fingertips. So I'm gonna choose two, and I have my wire, and I'm going to, like I said, make sure that bead fits on that wire. So they fit very well on my wire. And I also like to use these beads because they withstand the heat pretty well. You have to be careful when you're soldering with any kind of bead. You don't want to, overheat it and crack or damage your bead, which can happen if you hold the tip of your soldering iron onto your project for too long, or too close to a bead for too long. So what I'm doing is I chose two purple beads, and then I've made sure they both fit, and I snipped off 2 lengths of wire just like I did in the first part of the project. And we're going to add 2 more tendrils to our mushroom, but we're going to add beads to them. So as I did last time, I made a little loop at the top, but this time I closed the loop. And instead of just making like a hook and then making it into a curl, I actually made like a little closed loop at the top. Then I'm going to feed my crystal onto my wire, and you can use any kind of bead you like. And I'm going to give it a little bend in my wire so that bead doesn't just slide down to the bottom. You can choose any color you like. I really love, green a lot, and, it goes great with the whole mushroom, but I thought, let's do a little purple. Let's make it a little mystic. So that's why I chose that color. I did the same thing with both pieces of wire and both beads. I made a tendril at the top, or a little loop at the top, I should say, thread my bead on, and then give it just a little bit of a bend so that bead doesn't slide down, so it keeps it in place. And you can also, if you want to give them more bends, you can. I kind of do that with mine. I make them a little funky. They don't have to be, perfect in any way. You can do them however you like. I'm going to coat the wires with flux, just like I did earlier, and I'm going to carefully solder them around the bead. And I'm not touching the bead with my soldering iron. I'm just going over the top and the bottoms of the wires. I'm going to do the same thing with both wires. I'm going to flip them over, make sure I get both sides completely coated with solder. And then something different that I didn't do the last time around is I'm going to take a little drop of solder, and I'm going to use it to fill in that loop that I made at the end of the wire. That's why I said close that loop, so it can hold a little drop of solder. Now if your solder drips through, make sure you turn your iron down a little bit. It's probably too hot, and just try again. Sometimes it happens to me too. So check both sides, make sure they're nice and shiny. And then we're going to make sure that we have those little loops at the top filled in with a nice raised drop of solder. And sometimes I'll, do a little bit on the stem area as well. It takes a little bit of practice to do that. And sometimes I'll inadvertently just kind of drop a drop on there, and then I'll just keep it on there and I'll say, oh, it looks pretty good. So that's how I do it. So once you check those on both sides, we're ready to attach them. Before I try to attach these pieces, I'm always going to make sure that I have flux at all the areas where we are going to solder. So at the bottom of that mushroom stem, and on my little tendril pieces that I'm attaching, and I am holding them with my non-dominant hand. That's my left hand. That's why it is so shaky. And then I hold my hot soldering iron in my dominant hand. I'm right-handed, so that's how I do it. And I'm going to melt those ends right in there. And like I said earlier, I have a lot of solder at the bottom of that mushroom, so I really don't need to add a lot more, maybe just a tiny little bit on the tip of my soldering iron. And you also want to be quick, because if you hold the tip of your soldering iron at the bottom there, guess what's going to happen? Yeah, everything's going to melt apart and you're going to have all these pieces. So you have to kind of be quick with it. And, if your iron is hot enough and everything is, has a nice coating of flux on it and is tinned and warm, then it'll be fine. So This is a project from a new soldering book that I have coming out very shortly, so you're the first to know about that. So if you've ever had questions about soft soldering, maybe you're new to the craft, or maybe you're not, and you just want to know more about soldering irons and temperatures and the metals and the heat and chemicals and how everything works together, then you'll love this book. Stay tuned and I'll be talking about that a little bit closer to my release date, which of course I'll let you know about. But getting back to our project, once I have all my pieces on there, I'm going to use my pliers to separate them a little bit, maybe give them a little bit more of a bend if they need it. It's a 3D object, so we want to have a little bit of dimension. We don't want them all, like kind of stuck together. We want to kind of pull them apart a little bit. So I'm basically going to fiddle around with that. And, you don't want to overbend your wire because, if you bend a piece of wire back and forth too many times, it will break off. So you want to be a little bit careful with that. Once again, we find ourselves at this point. You can keep your pendant as is, or we can move on and do something else with it. And I'm going to add a vintage black patina to my pendant. I've assembled everything I need. I have an old plate that I only use for applying patina. Same with my paintbrush, it's only used for patina. And I have some paper towels for a quick cleanup if needed. I have my liquid patina and I'm going to put just a little bit on my plate, maybe about a half a teaspoon to 1 teaspoon. You do not need a lot. I'm going to put that lid right back on there. You don't want to have a spill or anything. Wipe it off, and then I'm going to pick up my paintbrush and just apply a little bit, and you can see that it's going to turn that silver metal black instantly. And here's a close-up so you can, get a better look. You want to also make sure that your project is clean. So yes, I do wash it before I apply the patina. You don't want to mix chemicals. So the best thing to do is after you're done with all your soldering, scrub it up, make sure it's completely dry. You cannot put patina on metal that is wet. So I'm going to continually just coat all the areas. I'm going to do the edges, I'm going to flip it over, and even underneath the mushroom cap, I'm going to just try to get all the silver areas coated with patina. And if you miss a little spot, it's okay, because in the end we're going to buff it down so some of that silver shines through. And when I get to the top and I can't hold it anymore, here's another note and a little aside. You can wear rubber gloves for this if you like. I usually don't. I usually just hold it by like the bail and then a paper towel. But you can do that. You don't want to get this on your skin. It is corrosive. If you do, make sure you rinse your hands and wash them well. And always follow the directions that are on the manufacturer's label. So moving on, I am just about done applying my patina. I'm going to hold it there so I can get the bail as best as I can, and then I'm going to blot off any big drips that are on there, and I'm just gonna let it set. I'm gonna let it set to dry, maybe about 5-10 minutes or so. You want to make sure you have a nice black finish, and if you have like a brownish finish or something, then maybe your project wasn't clean enough or your patina could be contaminated. So moving on to the next step, I'm going to take it over to my sink and I'm going to scrub it up with a little bit of dish detergent and a fingernail brush and some water. And I'm just going to make sure that, it's nice and clean. Some of that black patina will come off. And then for my very last step, I have a piece of steel wool and I am going to buff it. Now, since this project has some beads on it and it's kind of delicate with the wires, you want to be gentle and careful. Don't rush too much, take your time. And I like to go back and forth and in a circular motion, and we are trying to remove some of that black patina so the silver peeks through and you have a beautiful vintage finish. So I'll work on doing this for a few minutes until I'm happy with my finish. So while I finish buffing this up, I'll tell you again, I have a soldering book coming out. I'm real excited. And I also have a jewelry supply organizer book. Actually, I have a few of them. They have different covers. They are just beautiful and I can't wait to share them with you, but they are for recording like your inventory of all your supplies. And when you buy beads, sometimes you forget, where did I get these? They're beautiful. How much did I pay? And that's how you figure out what you charge for an item, is by, knowing what you paid for your supplies. So I'll talk about those next week. But the last thing to do with this pendant is I have a soft cloth that has a little bit of polish on it, and I'm going to very gently buff it up. And that is just to bring out the shine a little bit, just for a minute or two until I'm pleased with it. And then our pendant is finished. And I really hope you like this project. I love it. I think it's so cool. Again, you'll find it in my new book, and I will have more information about that very soon. But I hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe. I'm going to be back again very soon, and I'll be sharing my new jewelry supply logbook organizer with you, and I'm so excited about that, and I think you're going to love it. So thanks again for joining me, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys!